See, I think it's quite possible that the 1960s represented the last burst of the human being before he was extinguished, and that this is the beginning of the rest of the future now, that from now on there'll simply be all these robots walking around, feeling nothing, thinking nothing, and there'll be nobody left almost to remind them that there once was a species called a human being, with feelings and thoughts, and that history and memory are right now being erased, and soon nobody will really remember that life existed on the planet.
Happy heresies, and welcome to the desert of the real. Welcome with kindness and love.
This is blasphemy! This is madness!
Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio, broadcast through the God above God Dad can. This is your Homeric and Homer Simpson exploration of the world's most important and least known heretics and eternal archetypes of the counterculture. And that is the Gnostics, as well as their brothers in arms in the esoterica and free thought. This is a dream of you, becoming manifest in the waking thunder of tornado information and tsunami revelation. This is where you come to find out who you really are and what reality is really not. Here in the inner sanctum of Gnosis and the outer rectums of creation.
I know you love having the power of God at your fingertips. Get off on it.
I think the Arab Gnostic sage, Mononymous, quoted by Hippolytus, gives us a halcyon clue on how to enter further in this inner sanctum of Gnosis. Abandon the search for God and the creation and other matters of a similar sort. Look for Him by taking yourself as a starting point. Learn who it is within you that makes everything His own and says, my God, my mind, my thought, my soul, my body. Learn the sources of sorrow, joy, love, hate. Learn how it happens that one watches without willing, rests without willing, loves without willing. If you carefully investigate these matters, you will find Him within yourself.
They've done studies, 60% of the time, it works every time.
That doesn't make sense.
In the end, I, your host, Abraxas, in his monkey incarnation of Miguel Connor, is only here to midwife contraband truths and forbidden memories. You must find a mystery that works for you and only you, that dream of you and hope of glory, that ship smoke on the horizon Pink saw when he no longer saw the lips of the establishment moving. It is up to you to remember your godly origins, that divine fire, before the gods of this world broke your heart and made you look for the pieces scattered in a strip mall ground covered in false gold. As my friend Jim says, whatever works for you, just make sure it works.
I think they're looking for something worth dying for because it's easier than finding something worth living for.
We're born alone, we die alone. Everything else can be fixed with Photoshop.
After all, you and I are the revenge of the myth on our oppressors, Johnny Cash Bodhisattvas, occult Lebowskis, and those modern-day Tom Sawyers, are mine not for rent by any god or government. We're raging against heaven for our misplaced childhoods and paradises lost. We're forever on the battlefield of the true seeker warrior as the hordes of hell bear down upon us.
This is where we hold them! This is where we fight! This is where they die!
H.P. Blavatsky said there is no religion higher than the truth. And William Blake said a truth with bad intent is worse than all the lies you can invent. like the ones the archons and their sales representatives on Earth have been feeding us since the wheel was invented, and they taxed it and inflated its prices to sell as derivatives. In between, we don't get fooled again, or now or before. We follow our bliss, live for our bliss, and ultimately die for our bliss.
You are specks of dust beneath our fingernails. Your very breath is a gift from Olympus. You have insulted powers beyond your comprehension.
Like Jesus tells Judas Iscariot in the Gospel of Judas, already your horn has been raised, and your wrath is full, and your star passes by, and your heart is determined. And we are stars, like Crowley and Lennon said, or at least we are recalling how to be stars, not reaching for them like milk-warm spirituality would have it, but understanding their beauty and pathos. Or, as Oscar Wilde said, we are all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at stars. And Philip K. Dick said that the true God, the alien God of the Gnostics, was found in the gutter, along with the sinners and outcasts, and, unfortunately, probably a lot of hipsters.
Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life, that there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad.
Oh, I should clarify something I just said. The Gnostic International Tribunal, or GIT for short, has just informed me that calling the monad an alien god is not politically correct. So from now on, we will have to call the alien god the undocumented deity. Any more utterances of alien god by me or you carry the consequence of being taken to a pleromic rehabilitation interim camp, or PRIC for short. You have been warned. It's an undocumented deity.
You don't know what you're talking about, do you?
You're an inspiration for birth control.
We always try to give you a special show, my beloved truth seekers. But I tell you that on this February 16th, the year of our demiurge 2013, we really do have a special show. Our astral guest is the sagacious and sapient Nicola Denzey Lewis, professor of religious studies at Brown University. She materializes at the Agora of the Virtual Alexandria to discuss her new and arresting book, Introduction to Gnosticism, Ancient Voices, Christian Worlds. And our topic that she will hit out of the Heilig ballpark is making Gnosticism approachable.
It doesn't make any sense. Any fucking sense.
You see, to many, Gnosticism is downright bizarre. With its intricate cosmology, dreamlike theology, and radical ideology. Many who encounter Gnosticism after some interest basically run out in terror, like if it were an unorthodox Godzilla, or just fill in the spaces with indolent occultism, until it's a New Age version of John Carpenter's The Thing. Nicola's book streamlines Gnostic theology and ideology, but makes it accessible to anyone, even for those of Irish descent like me.
That's racist.
Unlike my mother, I stereotype. It's faster.
It places Gnosticism in a clear context before the backdrop of the stormy Roman Empire, touching its zeitgeist in a way that only a few scholars like Hans Jonas or Edward Gibbon could ever do.
Marcus Aurelius had a dream that was Rome, Proximo. This is not it. This is not it.
Her book brings the latest and greatest on Gnostic scholarship while crystallizing old and august theories. In our interview, we will rediscover the Gnostics in the clearest possible way, like virgins touched for the very first time.
John McCain has already tapped me and said that's where I want you.
Introduction to Gnosticism is a charged and fascinating book, my beloved truth seekers, and I can't wait to read it a second time. It's very much a textbook with insights and summaries galore, stimulating for the wonkish Gnostic enthusiast, as well as the WTF is this weirdness amateur. Heckate, it's even chock full of charts and timelines, granting a phoenix's eye view of the ancient heretics and their surrounding faith. Finally, I can compare the secret book of John, the hypostasis of the archons, and on the origin of the world side by side, and find out when and why Sophia, Yaldibaldi, Elilith, Below, and the invisible spigot did what they did in their various screen roles, and the secret meaning and symbolism behind it all.
No one knows what it means, but it's provocative.
I know the so-called Gnostic Gospels might seem odd to many. To me, they weren't the very first time I read them, but I am foobar in the head. Like Carl Jung once mentioned, reading the Gnostics felt like meeting again long-lost friends. The story of Sophia and the Demiurge and so forth were so familiar to me, resonated like a deja vu orgasm, a coming home. Yes, I saw that science fiction sensibility, and this led me to see all religions, even the orthodox ones, in a clear sense. I realized that they were all science fiction, since science fiction is just myth moving forward until it goes backward into allegory and inward into consciousness expansion. The Gnostics wrote science fiction in reverse to understand what went wrong in creation and what got lost in the soul's adventure through the cosmos. Jesus said in the Gospel of Thomas, you have to go to the beginning to know the end, and then you will rule over all.
Don't you see? It's not about you. It's about them.
But I can't go back.
Don't know that you got a choice, son. No man can walk out on his own story.
The Gnostics would have certainly agreed with Ray Bradbury, who said that he didn't write to predict the future, but to prevent it. The Gnostics wanted to go in all directions, even in the present, to prevent the traumatic corruption brought about by the worst angels of our nature. And bringing up Carl Jung again, he did say, all the works of men have their origin in creative fantasy. What right have we to then depreciate imagination?
You see, I keep thinking that what we need is a new language. A language of the heart. That is a new kind of poetry. And I think that in order to create that language, you're going to have to learn how you can go through a looking glass into another kind of perception where you have that sense of being united to all things, and suddenly you understand everything.
Please support Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio. I've had to cut back to about 2 shows a month these last 6 months. I hope to keep it at that level or go back to more shows. Thank you so much for you rainbows in the dark who continue to support this Hobbit podcast every week. You are certainly free to do whatever you want with your shekels, but please think of independent and alternative media Blade Runners instead of the corrupt replicants in the mass media. All mouthpieces for Jehovah and his angelic mafia.
I tell my kids, only God can make a life.
I'm also looking for extra work as a writer, blogger, journalist, copywriter, or really anything. If anyone has any leads or advice, please let me know. Lastly, Any leads on how to get on the Huffington Post or any large publication would be forever appreciated, and even compensated with a Pandora's box of free shows. But enough of my drivel. Let us to the interview with Nicola, and after I'll give you a framework for defining Gnosticism. Directly from her book we are discussing Introduction to Gnosticism, Ancient Voices, Christian Worlds. Steiner, the empire never ended, and death spares none but the tiger.
Our lives are not our own. From womb to tomb, we are bound to others. Past and present. And by each crime and every kindness, we birth our future.
This is the Aeon Byte interview, and with us we have the pleasure of being joined by Nicola Denzey Lewis to discuss her book, Introduction to Gnosticism, Ancient Voices, Christian Worlds. How are you doing today, Nicola?
I'm doing really well. How are you?
I'm doing great. Again, thank you very much for joining us. As you mentioned in your book, Gnosticism is a movement that people might find interesting, exposed to it perhaps through pop culture, literature, or education. Yet when they finally open these so-called Gnostic texts, they are often perplexed at the seeming weirdness. What approaches did you take in your book or in your classes to make Gnosticism more approachable and less like a 60s psychedelic sci-fi movie?
I think that's a great and hilarious question because I happen to be really partial to 60s psychedelic sci-fi movies.
They're great.
I'm a child. I was born in the middle of the 60s, and so really that's my habitus. I feel pretty comfortable there. You know, I think the weirdness, the strangeness of this text really is part of their beauty and part of what makes them compelling. And I think if you can use them to spark students' curiosity and readers' curiosity about these texts, find the part in us that's curious, that wants to figure them out, then you're already part of the way there to really kind of engaging them. But, I'm a scholar of religious studies, and one of the dictums that we use in RS is that our job is to make the familiar strange and the strange familiar. And I take this really seriously, particularly when I'm starting out courses in Gnosticism to try to see how I can do that. How can I make these strange texts familiar to them, but how can I also start with what's familiar to them already and make that strange so as to kind of lessen the distance between that. And, in my experience, I think the stuff that people know, what's familiar, tends to be either pop culture or the Bible, or if you're lucky, both. So let's, say that in the case of the Bible, before we try to make sense of a Gnostic text like Hypothesis of the Archons, we go back to Genesis. And actually we did this in my class yesterday, we're starting out. And we read Genesis from Genesis 1:1, and we go all the way through the stories of the creation right up to Cain and Abel, and we take turns reading it aloud. And after we've done that, it's a very familiar text to people in the class in varying degrees. Then we go back and I ask them questions about it and interrogate the text a little bit differently than they're accustomed to. So I ask them to find places in Genesis 1 and 2 which don't really make sense. And they can actually do this pretty easily. So questions like, so why are there two different accounts of the creation of humankind, right? Or why doesn't God know where Adam is in the garden, right? If he's omnipotent and omniscient, how come he has to say, he's walking around in the garden and you hear his footsteps and he's, Adam, where are you? It's a funny question for God to ask. Or the more troubling dimension about this, like, does God set up Adam? Why does he create this tree and tell them, that they can't eat of the fruit of this tree when presumably he knows that they're going to do that? Even more troubling, why does God lie? He says on the day that they eat that fruit, they will die, but they don't die on that day. And the serpent is the one who tells the truth and points this out. So there are a lot of troubling questions that come out of Genesis, which, even though it's a familiar text, once they start thinking that way, they start seeing that the familiar thing is really very strange. once we're there, we can go back to Hypothesis of the Archons and we can say, this text was motivated by people reading Genesis and asking the exact same questions that we've just asked about it. Why does God say, let us create humankind in our image? Why does he use the plural? And that a text like that looks so strange is really a very earnest intellectual attempt to make sense of the strangeness of a sacred text. So I think that you can kind of bridge the divide in that way. We're trying to make the familiar strange and the strange familiar.
And you mentioned pop culture and art. What references do you give your students to give a better perspective on Gnosticism?
I use movies all the time. From The Matrix to Inception to Stigmata. I show these in the very first class where I talk about the Gnostic myth, according to Hans Jonas. It's in the book as well. We go through that material. What's that Gnostic myth look like? And by the time we've gotten just a little bit of the way through it, generally people say, hey, The Matrix. That sounds like The Matrix. And it sort of happens invariably. It's a great kind of pop culture reference. Everybody's seen this movie. Everybody's familiar with it. And all of a sudden, they realize that they know this story. They've heard this story before. So, The Matrix comes up a lot. Movies are still being turned up all the time that have Gnostic themes in it. And again, the students are much more likely to be familiar with a film like Inception, or Shutter Island or something like that than they are with a fairly obscure text. So we use that a lot. Movies like Stigmata are great where they actually really are quoting text. That one uses the Gospel of Thomas a fair bit. I use music. I played Current 93's Thunder Perfect Mind in class yesterday. Yeah, David Tibet. And we learned recently, actually, he's a very learned coptologist. Yeah, and Stephen Emmel, who's a very, very highly respected scholar of Gnosticism, played guitar with Current 93. So, there they are kind of right in this interstitial world between academia and music, and they're producing, kind of an amazing sound poem from Thunder Perfect Mind. So he played that. Jordan Scott's Thunder Perfect Prada commercial. Anything that we can find out there that has tie-ins that are useful, it seems to be a sort of fair game.
Yeah, doesn't Tori Amos actually write to some music based on the Apocryphon of John?
The Apocryphon of John, that's right, exactly. She's got that. And there are a number of... Thunder Perfect Mind has been particularly inspiring to people, and for obvious reasons why, because it's such an extraordinary poem. So there are a number of operas in this, plays, there are album covers, names of albums, and Nurse with Wounded. They're out there.
Yes, they are. And, for example, if you're talking about the Gospel of Judas, it's always very easy to lean back on the last temptation of Christ, because that story was already there.
Absolutely, right. We talked about a little bit, Jesus Christ Superstar, ones that can really play with the figure of Judas, but the last temptation of Christ is fabulous for that.
And Nicola, central to Gnosticism is gnosis. How do you describe this experience to your students and other people?
That's a great question, too. And, I can't teach gnosis. I can teach Gnosticism. I can teach about this historical movement. And I have to really kind of teach around gnosis as something which is an experience which they may or may not be able to understand or identify with. We talk about different types of spiritual experience, enlightenment, what that looks like in other religious traditions, things that, again, don't attack it directly. I can't teach them that, but which speak to that. Again, a movie like The Matrix is helpful for that. What does it mean to have knowledge that profoundly changes your understanding of who you are and what your role is in this world? And I think, some students get it on an intuitive level, and other students don't, but they do understand it intellectually. I think it's so sort of fundamental to human experience. It's funny, I do a lot of yoga these days, and my yoga teacher, at the end of class, turns around and says, the light inside me honors and recognizes the light in each and every one of you. It's standard. I don't know whether it's Vedic, but I remember it from my studies of Hinduism. So in Hinduism, there's this idea that everybody has within them an inner light and that you can turn and recognize that. And it makes me think, years ago, I was actually in a Hare Krishna temple and I was interviewing a devotee, and he turned around as I was saying goodbye to him, and he said this very thing to me, sort of like the inner light of Krishna inside me sees and honors Krishna inside you. And I remember just being very struck at that moment, not only by his sincerity, but by, I think, the way in which his sincerity, ignited something in me at that moment. It was like, yes, he really recognized, this inner light in me, and he thought in it for a moment, I'm there, I see that, and I kind of acknowledge that in that person. And I was surprised by that encounter. I was struck by it. And it's little kind of moments like that, something very small, I think, where students, again, can have their own narratives, their own experiences. Some little moments where they think, so that's a part of what this gnosis thing seems to be about.
And I think Elaine Page often called it an aha moment, when you have an insight into yourself and the world. Nothing like the road of Damascus or Buddha on the tree. It's sort of a process.
Right, exactly. And it can be small but with profound consequences, or it doesn't have to have profound consequences to affect something in you, to change, that experience of that hour or that day.
And do you find Gnosis versus other traditions like Enlightenment or Salvation or Satori might be a little bit more intellectual, where you have this moment and you have to basically, philosophize in the ancient context? You have to understand the world. Like Neo, he had to go out there and see the world and gain as much mental knowledge as he could.
No, I don't actually see it as connected very much to any kind of, earthly intellectual systems or so on. I mean, I think that, as I understand it anyway, that's the moment of gnosis, and one that's really kind of transcended, and doesn't need to be sort of processed or intellectualized, although certainly that's in, the tradition in the text we talk about, because we only have certain tools and faculties for being able to articulate that experience and to teach it or to speak about it. We have to use words, we have to use systems and analogies and so on. So I think that's where it kind of comes in, this sort of second order work that we do to process something which is not inherently that.
Nicola, the term Gnosticism itself has been questioned in the last few decades by such scholars as Michael Williams and Karen King, even to the point of proposing that the term be discarded. Yet other scholars, including Birger Pearson and Marvin Meyer, contend it as a valid and useful term. What position do you take, or how do you approach this sort of being stuck on one side or the other or the middle?
I think my sympathies are pretty squarely aligned with Mike Williams and Karen King on this, and consider them two senior colleagues and friends, and people from whom I've learned a great deal. Although I certainly wouldn't put, Birger Pearson and Mark Meyer on the other side of that too. I miss Mark a lot. But as I understand it, in sort of the school in which I've been trained, I really think of Gnosticism as something that we have to be very careful with as a term, which is why, after much heeing and humming and hawing, we put Gnosticism in scare quotes for the title of this book. So it's Introduction to Gnosticism in quotations. I didn't want to have Gnosticism on there at all. I just wanted to say something about Nag Hammadi, because I don't treat every so-called Gnostic text. I'm really looking specifically at the Nag Hammadi corpus, because no other book does that, and it's such a complex world that I figured that's where people need the most help. But my editor said, no, I think we really need to put Gnosticism in there so that people will know it, because most people don't know what Nag Hammadi is. So let's throw in Gnosticism. So the only way I allow this to have Gnosticism is if we put it in scare quotes. So it's there. But that is true to, I think, how I think about what this thing we call Gnosticism looked like in the ancient world. Way back when I was writing my dissertation under Elaine Pagels, she challenged me to write my dissertation, which was on Gnosticism, without using the word Gnosticism. She did not allow me to use it.
Wow.
And
Challenge.
Yeah, it was very challenging. It was very vexing. And I remember her saying, well, if I don't say, this Gnostic movement, what can I say? And she said, well, was this person Christian? I was like, well, yes, it appears so. She said, well, then, call him a Christian. Or call her a Christian. Don't call her Gnostic. And it was a great exercise. It was very frustrating, but an important one, I think, to sit there and go over the text and say, is this term one that we're using for convenience, or is it really accurate? Is it really representative? What are we doing when we insist on calling Valentinus a Christian instead of a Gnostic, or even a Gnostic Christian? I think the problem with Gnosticism is that, as a term, is that it's both artificially a term that unites things, but also divides it. It unites things artificially by calling various movements, inclinations, texts, experiences, myths, all the same thing. It puts them all in the same rubric. And it divides by separating Gnosticism from Christianity and Gnostics from Christians. And I do think that if we asked Valentinus, he would have called himself a Christian. And if he had called himself a Gnostic, as certainly some Christians did, or Origen is one who uses the term, for instance, Clement of Alexandria, I don't think he would have seen that as being a separate thing from being Christian. Part of the consequences of that, too, right, is that we end up, Christianity is something which ends up looking more orthodox, more closed, more, I'll stick with orthodox, I think, than it really actually was. It keeps it a movement that looks a lot more like modern Christianity, maybe, or more like many Christians would like to see it, as something which is removed from, separate from the taint of Gnosticism. I'm a historian of the ancient world.
It was, certainly Morton Smith who said in a lecture that Gnosticism wasn't a good term, but we're sort of stuck with it. So, like you were stuck with it in your book. You just got to use it, or else nobody will notice.
Right. No, it is very tricky, and it's really hard to go without it. And, I slip up all the time because it's useful. But I have less of a problem talking about Gnostics than I do about talking about Gnosticism. And I think, when push comes to shove, I would say that no such thing as Christianity existed in the first 4 centuries, maybe even 5 centuries either. So, when I refuse to use Gnosticism, it's not saying that Gnosticism didn't exist, but Christianity did. Both these overarching labels keep us from really seeing, again, the tremendous diversities of religious experience in the ancient world.
But would you agree with Bentley Layton and David Brackey that it is sensible to at least say, well, the Sethians were the Gnostics, the artists formerly known as the Gnostics, as we call it?
Right. I haven't been completely sold over. I think tremendously highly of both those scholars, and David's book, I use both of them a lot, both in my book and in my teaching, but David Brackey's book is something I have some of my students read as well, and I love how he's gone and not really muddied the waters for those of us who are on this campaign against Gnosticism, but certainly continued to keep up the conversation in very intelligent, informed ways. There appear to have been Sethians running around, and no, they weren't calling themselves Sethians. We don't have any indication that they were, and that I'm not sure about whether or not they called themselves Gnostics, but they are a cohesive group, cohesive doctrine that's very different than, say, Valentinianism, who have some sort of group identity and set of texts. So, if you want to call them Gnostics, I'm good with that. I'm comfortable with that.
Yeah, on a side note, even the Manichaeans called themselves Christians for the most part. That's the term was just given to them, like Valentinians and all the others. Right. So they might be going, "What are you calling me?"
Right, precisely. And I think we put a lot of time and energy into this categorization. We have to realize that we are the ones who create these categories, and they may or may not work for us. And I think we see that really very clearly in in studies of Gnosticism, where not only do we have this thing, Gnosticism, but then we have these groups that we have more or less created, like the Satanism or Valentinianism, and then we don't know what to do when the texts actually really don't fit very nicely into those rubrics. And that kind of happens all the time. And it should really lead us to question our categories. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't.
Another roadblock to not quote-unquote Gnosticism, and you do address this in your book, is that on the surface many of their texts seem downright hostile to Jewish scripture. Some have even called them anti-Semitic. I'm sure some of your students, when they're reading, their faces must just light up or be cringe in terror. How do you deal with this issue?
You know, I actually wish that more students were horrified by the anti-Semitism in the text than are, and I'm always a little sort of surprised by that. And generally, I'll have one or two that have come out every year and will go, hey, this is terrible. And I think that's a good thing. And, you know, I don't feel like I have to be an apologist for these texts. They are what they are. They're ancient texts. They don't come out of our culture. They have very different sensibilities. They have very different ways of thinking about race, about origin, you know, all these terms that are very loaded for us. It was they still have social systems that were absolutely heavily dependent on slavery, you know. And yes, there is anti-Semitism there in some of them, I think, in a way that should trouble us as contemporary, as modern readers, but also in a way that we understand that is kind of what the ancient world was like. And these were times where, you know, tempers were running high or fevers were running high. You know, people were engaged in very protracted battles about identity and group and what it meant to be part of a community that pitches itself against another community. We can't even, I think, from where we sit anyway in the United States today, even really get a sense of what was at stake in some of those things. But, you know, yeah, it's there. I think one of the only things I can do with, say, the anti-Semitism in these texts is go back to the writings of the New Testament, which when I'm teaching a New Testament survey, when I teach another class on called Judaism and Christianity, a conflictual history, where I try to look at a lot of those texts, a lot of the anti-Semitic productions in the last 2,000 years. You know, we say, what's part of the tradition? There's a lot of anti-Semitism in the Gospel of John. You know, it saturates it. There's a lot of anti-Semitism, not through the Gospel of Matthew, but in the one line of the, you know, the blood libel line towards the end of the Passion narrative, where the Jews say that they're going to take on the guilt of putting Jesus to death, not just for themselves, but for their children. You know, the blood libel line. Those are blood-curdling moments. They're terrible moments when Jesus turns and tells the Jews that, you know, Satan is their father. Awful. And they're central, you know, to the New Testament and to formative Christianity. So we have to kind of deal with these painful moments in the New Testament as much as we do in Gnosticism.
Right. Even Paul talks about how angels brought the Torah to Moses and there was a veil over his eyes. So, but in a sense,
exactly.
Don't you think that the Gnostics were like Paul might have been? They were trying to make sense of these Jewish scriptures. They were reinterpreting, or as you say, when you you make your students read Genesis, they were trying to fill in the gaps, perhaps?
Oh, I think they're definitely trying to fill in the gaps. And you know, when they're exegeting Genesis, I don't see it as protest exegesis. I don't see it as simply inverting the values of the Hebrew Bible, you know, and making Yahweh into nothing but an evil demon because they're protesting against it as sectarian Jews or breakaway Jews. I don't really read it that way. I read it differently. I read it as people who have a very deep Greco-Roman education. They know their Plato, and what Plato talks about happening at the beginning of creation is very different than what Genesis talks about. And they're trying to reconcile these pictures. As they understand it, God has to be only good. So if he's behaving in a way that seems not to be good, then the only solution can be that that's not God, that there's another God. And I don't think that it's so much sort of a castigation of Judaism. Maybe I'm wrong here, but that's the way that I read it. But as a way of preserving Genesis as a text which is sacred, which is true. It's just only true when you read it a certain way. And I don't see that as inherently an anti-Semitic thing.
And it's a fact that, as you said, by the time Jews became Hellenized, it was very common to break up God into different things and make his underlings do all the work, and God just kind of stood there and let Metatron or Michael do all the dirty work.
Right, and there's been, a lot of work that's been done on the sort of the changing theology in Judaism as it sort of encounters Greek ideas of divinity. And, so you find that sort of, God becomes this more and more sort of distant, abstract figure, and then you're left with, again, this Yahweh in Genesis who behaves in ways that are sort of head-scratching when you try to reconcile that. But that is an authentic, I'm sure I like that word, but that is a very Jewish way of understanding God, not as the Yahweh who walks around in the garden but also as a Yahweh who couldn't possibly walk around in the garden. They're both Jewish ideas of what.
There was a book that came out on Thunder the Perfect Mind, and it's written by several scholars, and they talk about how the Gnostics really enjoyed parody and satire. In your book, you obviously show that they love puns, but most ancient writers really love puns. Do you see the Gnostics using satire at all in their work, or do you think they were taking it really seriously?
That's a great question. They're definitely using puns. And it's always so hard to see humor. That's one of the things that's fascinating me in the ancient world. Like, can you detect humor in a text that doesn't seem to be funny? I don't know. But we were reading in class yesterday, Hypothesis of the Archons, and one of my students is a religious studies major, but also he does a lot of just dramatic arts things. He came in so excited, and he said, I am going to do a puppet show based on. And so he's off working on his puppet show right now, and what he said really kind of inspired him is that scene of the Archons huffing and puffing and blowing to try to animate Adam, and how Adam just lies there, and Karen King has a wonderful article where she talks about sort of ideas of masculinity and caricatures and so on in this text, and she points out, how funny this is to readers to have, these Archons huffing and puffing, in a way that's futile. So my student is actually kind of acting this out with the puppets of the huffing and puffing, but Adam is a real human being in the puppet show. So he just thought that idea of puppets trying to blow their breath that puppets don't have into a real living human being who's lying there inert on the ground was kind of a little funny, play. And it was both comedic and sort of ironic in a way that he appreciated. So, I think that there are moments there that are very wry.
Yeah, and like you mentioned in your book, some of it might be horrific to us, like why the Archons have such a high libido, even though they're androgynous, and they go around raping people. But like you said, in the Roman Empire, that was so commonplace, as was death and so forth, is something they had to deal with.
Right, absolutely. Very much a part of life. As I say, that's how people get founded, right? And there's plenty of stories that are coming out in Greek mythology of gods who are coming down and having sex with human women and creating these demigods. Women don't really have much of a choice of it and don't play very nice, very large roles and often come to bad ends. So it was very much, again, part of the landscape for them.
And what about the origins of Gnosticism, which has been debated probably since early Christian times? What do you think are their origins, or what are the more sensible theories out there? It seems you like to take the John Turner model of the dissatisfied Jews who went Christian and then later got kicked out of church and became sort of Neoplatonic Gnostics.
I think, with John Turner on this, I think he probably really is correct in this reconstruction. And I'm a historian. I look at these texts within the broad context of the Roman Empire, and it seems to me any kind of search for Gnosticism's origins earlier than the 2nd century, it doesn't make an awful lot of sense to me. I really see the majority of the texts we have as very 2nd century texts. I think in the 2nd century of the Roman Empire, it's a time of real kind of religious innovation, where people become very interested in individual religious movements and individual salvation and independent religious entrepreneurs who come, passing through the cities and the countryside, peddling various sort of religious commodities, different cults, different groups, things that people can join in and participate. And that was a very different landscape than, say, 1st century Rome, which was more focused around the civic cult. So in the 2nd century, people were really interested in all these things. There's a kind of wave of orientalizing interest in the, esoteric traditions of the East, the rise of Mithraism, in this time, the rise of the Isis religions in Serapis. There was a lot of interest in mystery religions, we call them mystery cults. And I think in that environment, in cities like Rome, Edessa, and Alexandria, there's sort of crucibles, again, for a whole lot of religious speculation. And I see this text as really sort of coming out of moments like that when people are free to be kind of experimental, because there are no laws out there on what it looks like to be Christian, what Christianity is, even what Judaism is. We used to think we had a much better idea of what Judaism was than we're prepared to admit now. It looked different in different places at different times, and there was no normative Judaism. It just really wasn't. It's a myth. There was no normative Christianity in the 2nd century. So people are kind of picking and choosing, and they're running these experiments, where they fit into things and how's the proper way of conducting ritual and when and where. It's all really up in the air, and that's why I'm fascinated with that century. We've done an awful lot of work on it, and it takes a couple of hundred years for people to kind of work through that. And I think what we do see is, Gnosticism coming out of, you see how I had to use the word, even though I don't like using words, a lot of these Gnostic groups situating themselves within different Christian communities, and at some point no longer being either welcome there or finding themselves sympathetic to the way that certain Christian groups turned. And I think that this can happen even within the so-called Gnostic Christian groups as well. I think that the people who Plotinus knows, these ones that we may call Sethians or we may call Gnostics, I don't think that they see themselves as Christians. I think they do see themselves as being Platonists. They're more or less kind of free-floating. They've moved in a new direction as a group. I think that even whoever wrote the Gospel of Judas, which is such a bizarre text, and if anybody's read it and they've seen it, it's one of the only texts that we have that actually has no salvation. It's pretty bleak in many ways. My pet theory on that is it's actually written by somebody who was in a Sethian group and then figured that the Sethians had gotten it wrong and broke away from Sethianism. So not only it's not as simple a case as the Sethians having broken away from Christianity, but even somebody who had broken away from already what was maybe a splinter movement.
And as you point out in your book, and this might surprise a lot of people, the Gospel of Judas has not been fully reconstructed yet. So there's still a lot to be left, even within the debate of whether Judas was a villain with April DeConnick and Judas was a hero with Marvin Meyer, and then everybody trying to figure out who Judas was.
Yeah, no, that was a great moment, and kind of funny, a great example of scholarly hubris in a way, because everybody was so excited to have gotten this text. And like, okay, well, we've got this, let's go out and, publish critical editions and throw it out there, and we had it really incomplete. And I think we're probably used to having texts that are incomplete, frankly. It doesn't throw us too much. But it will be very interesting when the whole thing is reconstructed, and we'll see if we have an answer to some of these questions that, again, we've guessed at, and we've guessed differently according to our own understandings of the background context.
And as you point out also in your book,
Yeah.
and speaking of the Gospel of Judas versus the other Gnostic corpus, the Gnostics are always accused of being like the emos or goths of the ancient world, just sour and dour and so forth. Though you point out is the endings of their texts is very positive. I mean, they're basically saying everything's going to be okay, everything's going to be fine in the end.
Yeah. No, I have a whole book on this, which is actually coming out next month. On cosmology and fatalism in Gnosticism and in the second century in general. I'm really looking at the idea that the Gnostics were cosmic pessimists, and they just thought that the whole world had gone to hell in a handbasket, and it was a very bleak and nihilistic understanding of the world. And this is very Hans Jonas. He studied nihilism, studied existentialism, and really kind of saw that in the text that he was reading. This is before he was reading Nag Hammadi. And I think, there are a lot of bleak moments out there, even in more canonical Christian writings, but I find them tremendously helpful, hopeful texts, where there's real moments of transcendence at the end of many of them. It's really extraordinary. So I don't see them as pessimistic at all. But again, here the Gospel of Judas is different, and we'll see where it goes. It's not just that it seems to be moving towards possible resolutions, could be good or bad, and we just don't have the end. To me, the entire worldview is cynical in a way that I haven't seen in any other text from the same period.
Your book has many fascinating insights, even for those versed in Gnostic scholarship. One, for example, is that you propose that the Nag Hammadi library wasn't buried by monks to safeguard their existence from censorship, but it has to do with an Egyptian custom. Could you tell us about it?
Yeah, this came from some work that I was doing from a very talented undergraduate, Justine Ariel, who's now finished her master's degree. But at the time she was a senior at Brown and double concentrating in religious studies and Egyptology. And it's just fabulous because I think one of the things that we're really not very good at, those of us who work in Gnosticism, is knowing enough about Egyptology or Egyptian religion. It's just not part of our skill set. Most of us are coming from studying New Testament or biblical studies. And it's really a shame. I think there's a whole lot out there in Egyptology that could be useful to us. But Justine started doing this work of exploring the idea of whether these could be Gnostic Christian books of the dead, not just the Nag Hammadi codices, but the other codices that we have as well, the ASCII Codex, the Berlin Codex, Bruce Codex. And while she was working on that, simultaneously I was working on the Intro to Gnosticism textbook, and I started to write out the story. It was a famous fine story, Muhammad Ali as someone out there and, digging for manure out in the Wadi Latrun. And as I kind of started working through that text, I just realized that there were, in fact, a lot of discrepancies. There were lots of things that changed from one version to the other. And so I started to kind of probe that a little bit more deeply, all the way through from the beginning of the story with Muhammad Ali looking for something that day, all the way to the end point of the story, which is generally that the Pachomian monks buried these books, maybe under the force of Athanasius of Alexandria's Vestal Letter of 367 that said which books should be read and should not be read. These monks had gone out into the desert and deposited these books for posterity. And the phrase is always used for posterity. I thought the story was true for a very long time. But the more I started doing research, the more I started looking at papyrological stuff, cosmological texts, making my way through the social history of late antique Egypt, I thought, oh my gosh, if this were the case, it would be our only example of Egyptian monks deliberately hiding books for posterity. The phrase is one that Jim Robinson has used when he first told the story, and it's in a lot of publications, and every time you find it used, people are directly citing Jim Robinson. And I thought, well, okay, so what about this whole Pachomian theory? There's absolutely not a shred of evidence to connect the Nag Hammadi codices with Comian monasticism. There's none. There's nothing. And we don't have that jar even, and this, the lid that we have that was supposedly from that jar is a very, very common piece of, I think it's red slip ware from 5th century Egypt. There's a ton of that in the desert. We don't have anything to connect that jar lid to the jar. The jar is missing. There just isn't anything to say that these books had anything to do with Pacomian monks. So I thought, well, okay, if they weren't buried for posterity, what might they have been buried for? And as it turns out, Egypt has a very, very long history of depositing books in tombs as guides for the afterlife. So I started to really become intrigued with this idea. Could it have been that the Nag Hammadi codices had been intended to be tomb deposits? And, all the pieces started to kind of fall in place. It was really quite extraordinary based on the research that Justine did and the research that I did as well. Evidence of other tomb robbings that produced books at the time, other examples archaeologically of books that came out of tombs. So we have multiple instances of books put in tombs really very late, all the way through Egyptian history, but not one example of monks burying a book for posterity. So that's my new theory, and I think I'm right. I think that these books were, again, they were deliberately produced volumes with esoteric and eschatological leanings and insights that were compiled as luxury objects and given to citizens, people with money, and to be buried in their tombs with them as guides for the afterlife.
Nicola, when Gnosticism really surfaced in our culture, many scholars, including Elaine Pagels, contended the Gnostics were egalitarian to the point they flirted with feminism. This stance was reversed. Yano Kuliano is an example. But it seems to be coming around again, especially with the work of April DeConnick. Where do you stand on how progressive the Gnostics were?
Well, again, I think this is where that blanket term Gnosticism doesn't get us very far. I think if you look at the range of writings we have at Nag Hammadi, we find ones that are astonishingly progressive, and so it seems to me. And so there's a lot of diversity, a lot of variations there in the way that women were regarded, apparently. On the one hand, you have a text like Thunder Perfect Mind, which is really extraordinary in its, we might call it subaltern voice. I mean, it's just a divine feminine voice, but it's also the voice of a woman who's been just about broken. I mean, it's somebody who's has, in a sense, a very small voice, and somebody who's been violated, somebody who has lost a great deal, somebody who's been despised. To have any ancient writing written from the perspective of either a divine female or a completely subjugated female is extraordinary. I mean, it's mind-blowing. It's hard to sort of wrap your mind around, even when you try to make sense of it by going to Jewish wisdom writings, things like Proverbs 8, where you have the voice of a female wisdom figure speaking. It's still kind of extraordinary to see it there. Hypothesis of the Archons, again, the role of women in that text, and Norea as the savior figure is remarkable, unparalleled. We just don't see it before. It jumps out. We were talking in my class yesterday about that, the account of the Archons raping Eve, and the passage of that Eve's spiritual essence going out of her and going into a tree, so that so that she was only her body that was defiled, and how that was both a very horrifying image to think that people might be spiritually empty in that same way, but also very sort of modern image when we compare that to modern accounts of women's rapes, where women, dissociate themselves and say, well, he might have defiled my body, but, he can't hurt the inner pure part of me. And that comes out so often from victims' testimonies that, again, it's jarring to see, who would have put that there? Who would have known about that? Who would have, and it's really kind of hard to say. On the Origin of the World is another one where the first being was created. The first spiritual being is a female being. And it's sort of mind-blowing to see that and think, oh, Eve was first. It was not Adam. Wait a minute. Wow. Seriously?
She's the boss. Eve is the boss.
Yeah, really kind of something that seemed not just kind of progressive, socially progressive. I think of Paul, the Apostle Paul, for instance, in his letter to the Corinthians, when he's talking about sexual rules within marriage. That's progressive, right? Because he says men and women should honor one another, their sexual needs, and should abstain, but only by agreement. All of that's progressive. This is on a whole other order. On the other hand, you have texts like the Gospel of Thomas, Logia 1:14, with Peter saying, let Mary go from us because women are not worthy of life. And Jesus talks him down a bit, but maybe not as much as he'd like. Was his answer, bring her to me so that I may make her more male so that she can enter the kingdom of heaven, is one that certainly women in my class aren't very comforted by. Or, book of Thomas the Contender, and other books that are certainly not very open towards women. So it's a mixed bag, I think, different communities. But the Roman Empire was, roughly speaking, fairly good about women. Well, you could have women teaching. You could have women speakers, women who are held in respect. And I don't think the women teachers who are out and running around were deeply shocking to many people. But they were there.
What are some of the so-called Gnostic texts you find that really speak to your students and maybe surprise you?
The one that they like, which surprises me, it's not actually in the textbook because it's not a Nag Hammadi text, is Ptolemy's letter to Flora. I don't know why they like that one. Maybe it's very clear. And here's Ptolemy, 2nd century Valentinian writer, writing to a female disciple and kind of laying things out for her. And I think they like the clarity of it, especially when we hit it fairly late after, I've marched them through Gospel of the Egyptians, or, something really inscrutable. But they tend to like that, and maybe again because it's got, we can kind of ground it in a particular place and time in a way that makes them feel more secure. There's so much kind of unknowing surrounding these texts that often students have a rough time with it. It's like, well, how can we know who wrote this? And how can we know when it was written? And how can we can't know any of these things. And they don't like that. The other one they tend to like is the Gospel of Truth. Yeah, they really like that. It's usually the one that they say is their favorite.
Yeah, it's a beautiful gospel from beginning to end.
It is. It really is a beautiful gospel. And I think they really like the paranesis. They like the exhortation to, go and take care of the sick and, minister to the poor and all that stuff. And all of a sudden, again, this community looks like a sort of a sympathetic and caring one that they like. It's like, oh, this is nice. They're doing good work and they're caring for one another, and I recognize this from my church, or they're not awful elitists or whatever else. But they like, again, that sort of that human side that they suddenly see kind of coming up in that text.
Is there any text you personally really like, or a body of text that you like?
Oh, I like so many of these texts, and it moves around from time to time. I'll sort of get kind of deeply nestled into one of them and sit there for a while and go, this is really amazing. And sort of work my way out. I think perennial ones that still kind of come back to me. I really think the Gospel of Thomas is a really extraordinary text. And maybe it's just because it's got those nice sound bites, but you can just kind of take little munches out of it. And some of the sayings are just, I think, tremendously powerful. So I like the tightness of it as a text. But, the sayings, they have a logic that is, it's hard to kind of pick out how they flow from one to the other, but it tends to be pretty associative and almost intuitive, and I like that. But I think the sayings themselves are so great, and I think probably one of the early ones that spoke to me is Logia 50, sort of where you have the questions in there about, if they take you, what shall you say to them? And saying we are children of the living Father, and we come from the light, and we'll return to the light. And I find those words really very moving. And I don't know why. I just sort of, I think it's a beautiful image, and I see those sorts of words, those people saying this sort of lovely thing, percolates through so many religious texts in antiquity, and I find something about that very moving. And those exact words showing up in other texts, but beyond that as well, you also see very similar sorts of articulations in non-Gnostic texts, supposedly, like the Greek Orphic Lamella. So, I don't know, so that's one that particularly moves me.
And to end, Nicola, what do you tell your students or think is the legacy the Gnostics had on both ancient and modern world?
That is such a hard question, and I don't know that I have any kind of a brilliant answer, or even a good answer for it. And I think I'll take us back to the pop culture stuff and the popularity of a movie like The Matrix. I think it's a great testimony to Gnosticism that an ancient set of ideas are still with us today as something which people can find inspirational. And not everybody will read these texts and go and join a Gnostic community. Some will, most won't. But I think a lot of people can read these texts and recognize that in them, again, themes of alienation and belonging, things of sort of spiritual return that still very powerfully resonate with a lot of people.
Well, I think that's all the time we have today, Nicola. I'd like to thank you very much for coming on Aeon Byte and discussing your wonderful book, Introduction to Gnosticism, Ancient Voices, Christian Worlds.
It was a great pleasure being here, and thank you very much.
And there you have it, my beloved truth seekers. A tour de force into the forbidden catacombs of Gnosis, headed by the wonderful Nicola Denzey Lewis, Professor of Religious Studies at Brown University. A nice taste of her new galvanizing work, Introduction to Gnosticism, Ancient Voices, Christian Worlds. Sometimes it takes a while for any new tradition to click. With me, certainly reading Philip K. Dick was a final catharsis. But Nicola's book will be the psychic Red Bull you need to make Gnosticism approachable. Nicola is right about many things, but certainly right that when we really see all mainstream religions with a virgin eye, they are just as odd as Gnosticism is accused of being. God became flesh and committed suicide to save the world. Moses and Muhammad went to war in the middle of a backward desert to redeem the cosmos. Hey, that's Dune. Science fiction. As promised, or you might feel threatened since it came from my gob, let me give you a framework that defines Gnosticism. It's from German scholar Christoph Marxies. I'm sure I'm saying his name wrong. From his book, Gnosis, An Introduction. The list is considered by many to be the most concise definition in the last decade. Nicola offers these defining characteristics in her book, as well as several other from other academics. Take it for what it's worth, but I assure you it's worth a lot. Here they be. Number 1, the experience of a completely otherworldly, distant supreme God. Number 2, the introduction of further divine figures, conditioned by this experience, or by the splitting up of existing figures into figures that are closer to human beings than the remote supreme God. Number 3, the estimation of the world and matter as evil creation, and an experience of the alienation of the Gnostic in the world. Number 4, the introduction of a distinct creator god or assistant. Within the Platonic tradition he is called craftsman, Greek demiurgus, and is sometimes described in Gnostic documents as merely ignorant, but sometimes also as evil. Number 5, the explanation of the state of affairs by a mythological drama in which a divine element, one that falls from its sphere into an evil world, slumbers in human beings of one class as a divine spark and can be freed from this state. Number 6, knowledge or gnosis about this state, which, however, can be gained only through a redeemer figure from the other world who descends from a higher sphere and ascends to it again. Number 7, the redemption of human beings through the knowledge of that, quote, that God or that spark in them, unquote. Number 8, a tendency towards dualism of different types, which can express itself in the concept of God, in the opposition of spirit and matter, and in the concept of human being as constituted of body plus soul. Let me know what you thinketh about this list. And again, take it for what it's worth. Whatever works for you, just make sure it works. And that should do it. Thank you from the bottom of my black heart for materializing at the virtual Alexandria. You make me feel like a natural bar below. We are the Gnostics, the lovers of the esoterica, and the Dionysian freethinkers. We are the veterans of 1,000 psychic wars who have set the controls to the heart of the sun. We are the eternal soundtrack of the counterculture, blazing the darkness of mere being with our Orphic tunes. I am Abraxas, broadcasting at the virtual Alexandria through the God above God.cam. The road is ended, the song is over, thought I'd have something more to say. But don't cultivate any troubles, my beloved truth seekers, because like heaven above you, the spy that loved you, I'm keeping all of your secrets safe with me tonight.